the dinner that changed everything. The crystal chandelier cast a warm glow over the mahogany table, its light dancing across the faces of 12 family members gathered for what should have been a celebration. Sarah Mitchell sat quietly in her chair, her hands folded in her lap, watching the flickering candles that lined the center of the table. She had spent 3 days planning this dinner, hoping it would bring the family closer together. Instead, she was about to discover just how far apart they had grown. Her husband, Marcus, sat at the head of the table, his voice booming as he told another story about his latest business deal. Sarah's mother-in-law, Patricia, nodded along enthusiastically, while Marcus's younger brother, Devin, laughed at all the right moments. Sarah's own parents sat near the other end, their faces tight with something that looked like concern. The dining room smelled of rosemary and roasted lamb, dishes Sarah had prepared herself. Because Marcus insisted that catered food lacked personal touch, she had been cooking since dawn, her feet aching in the elegant heels Marcus had asked her to wear. The white dress she had chosen felt suddenly too delicate, too vulnerable for what was about to unfold. "And that's when I told them," Marcus was saying, his chest puffed with pride. "If they want to work with Mitchell Enterprises, they need to understand who's in charge." Mitchell Enterprises. The name hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah felt her fingers tighten around the napkin in her lap. "Marcus has always been such a natural leader," Patricia cooed from across the table, reaching over to pat her son's hand. "Even as a little boy, he knew how to take command of a situation." Sarah's sister Jennifer caught her eye from 3 seats down. Jennifer's expression held a question, a worried furrow between her eyebrows that Sarah had learned to read over 32 years of sisterhood. Sarah gave the slightest shake of her head. Not yet. The servers, 2 young women Sarah had hired for the evening, brought out the main course. The plates were arranged beautifully, each one a work of art that Sarah had spent hours perfecting the presentation for. She watched as they were placed in front of each guest, waiting for some acknowledgement of the effort, the care, the love that had gone into every detail. "Darling," Marcus said, not looking at her, "the lamb seems a bit overdone." Sarah looked down at her own plate. The meat was perfectly pink in the center, exactly as Marcus had requested last week when they'd discussed the menu. She opened her mouth to respond, but Patricia spoke first. "Oh, Marcus, you're right. Sarah, sweetheart, you really should have hired a professional chef. This is supposed to be a special occasion after all." The words landed like small stones, each one carefully aimed. Sarah felt them accumulate, building a wall she could feel pressing against her chest. She had been feeling these walls for years now, closing in slowly, so gradually that she hadn't noticed until she could barely breathe. "It's delicious, honey," her father said quietly from down the table. Her mother squeezed his hand, a gesture of solidarity that Sarah noticed even across the distance. Marcus laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. "Dad, you don't have to protect her feelings. Sarah knows she's not exactly domestic goddess material. That's why I've been carrying this family financially all these years." The conversations around the table stuttered and stopped. The silence that followed felt thick, dangerous. Sarah could hear the gentle clink of crystal as someone set down their wine glass, the distant sound of traffic from the street outside their brownstone. "Marcus," Sarah said softly, her voice steady despite the trembling she felt in her core. "That's not quite accurate." He turned to look at her then, really look at her for the first time that evening. His eyes were cold, assessing. "Excuse me?" "The financial situation. It's not quite how you're describing it." Marcus's jaw tightened. Sarah could see the muscle there jumping, a tell she had learned to recognize as a warning sign. But tonight, something in her refused to back down. Maybe it was the presence of her own family, their concerned faces giving her strength. Maybe it was simply that she had reached a limit she didn't know existed until she crossed it. "Sarah," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous pitch, "don't embarrass yourself. We all know who built Mitchell Enterprises from the ground up." "Actually," Sarah said, surprised by the calm in her own voice, "I think there's been some confusion about that." "For a very long time." Patricia set down her fork with a deliberate clink. "What are you trying to say, dear?" Sarah looked around the table, at the faces of people she had welcomed into her home, people she had cooked for and cared for and tried so desperately to please. Jennifer was watching her with wide eyes, a small smile starting to form. Her parents sat very still, waiting. "I'm saying," Sarah continued, "that the narrative we've all been accepting isn't the complete truth." Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. The sound was harsh, violent in the quiet room. He leaned toward Sarah, his face twisted with an anger that seemed to come from somewhere deep and ancient. "You ungrateful." He didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he did something that would replay in Sarah's mind for years to come. Something that would become the dividing line between the life she had been living and the life she was about to claim. He spat at her. The saliva landed on her cheek, warm and shocking. The room erupted in gasps and exclamations. Sarah sat perfectly still, feeling the moisture slide down her face, dripping onto the white fabric of her dress. She didn't move to wipe it away. She simply sat there, letting everyone see exactly what Marcus had done. "Oh my God," Jennifer breathed, already rising from her chair, but Sarah held up one hand, stopping her sister. With the other hand, she calmly picked up her napkin and dabbed at her cheek. She stood slowly, with a grace that came from years of holding herself together when everything inside wanted to shatter. "Sit down, Marcus," she said quietly. "Don't you dare tell me—" "Sit down." This time, her voice carried a weight that made everyone in the room freeze. Even Marcus, in his fury, seemed to sense that something fundamental had shifted. He sat. Sarah walked to the sideboard, where she had placed her purse earlier in the evening. From it, she pulled a manila folder, the edges worn from the number of times she had opened it, looked at the contents, and then tucked it away, waiting for the right moment. This, she realized, was the right moment. 10 years ago, Sarah began, her voice steady as she walked back to her place at the table. "When we were first married, I received an inheritance from my grandmother, $3 million. She saw the confusion on several faces around the table. Marcus had gone very still. Marcus wanted to start a business. He had big dreams, but no capital. I believed in those dreams. I believed in him, so I invested my inheritance. In return, I asked for something very simple." She opened the folder, pulling out a document. "I asked for 90% ownership of the company." The silence in the room was absolute. "I didn't need the recognition," Sarah continued. "I didn't need people to know. Marcus wanted to be the face of the company, the CEO, the one making deals and building relationships. I was happy to let him have that. I worked behind the scenes, managing operations, handling the finances, building the systems that allowed Mitchell Enterprises to grow." She placed the document on the table in front of Marcus. It was the original operating agreement, signed by both of them, notarized and official. "For 10 years, I've watched you tell people that you built this company from nothing. I've listened to you describe yourself as the sole provider for our family. I've accepted your mother's criticisms about my contributions. I've made myself smaller and smaller to make room for your ego." Patricia reached for the document, her face pale. "This can't be—" "It's real, Patricia. Completely legal and binding. I own 90% of Mitchell Enterprises. Marcus owns 10%. The salary he draws, the car he drives, the lifestyle we've maintained, it all comes from a company that is, legally and financially, primarily mine." Marcus's hands were shaking. Sarah watched as the reality settled over him, as he calculated what this meant, what it had always meant. "Why?" Jennifer asked softly. "Why did you let him treat you like this if you held all the power?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. "Because I loved him. Because I believed that a good marriage meant supporting your partner, even if that support was invisible. Because I thought that love meant making sacrifices." She looked at Marcus then, really looked at him, seeing the man she had married and the man he had become. "But love should never mean accepting disrespect. And tonight, Marcus showed me exactly how little regard he has for me, for my dignity, for everything I've given." She turned to address the whole table. "I want you all to know that tomorrow morning I'm filing for divorce. I'm also implementing immediate changes to the company structure. Marcus will be removed as CEO. I'll be hiring new management or taking over those duties myself." "You can't do this," Marcus shouted, finding his voice at last. "You can't just destroy everything I've built." "Everything we built," Sarah corrected gently. "But yes, I can, and I am." Her father stood, walked around the table, and placed his hand on her shoulder. The weight of it, the solid support, nearly broke through the composure she was barely maintaining. "We're proud of you, sweetheart," he said. "We've been waiting for you to see your own worth for a very long time." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The dinner party dissolved after that. Patricia and Devin left in a fury of protests and threats. Other family members departed with awkward goodbyes and promises to call. Finally, only Sarah and her immediate family remained, along with the ruins of the meal she had worked so hard to prepare. Jennifer helped her clean up, the two sisters working in companionable silence. When the last dish was washed and put away, Sarah stood in her kitchen, looking at the evidence of the evening, a dark stain on her white dress, the crumpled napkins, the half-eaten food. "Are you okay?" Jennifer asked. Sarah thought about the question. She thought about the years of making herself small, of accepting crumbs of appreciation, of believing that her worth was measured by how much she could give without acknowledgement. "I will be," she said finally. "I think I will be." And standing there in her kitchen, still wearing the dress that bore the stain of her husband's contempt, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt powerful. She felt free. She felt for the first time in a very long time like herself. The road ahead would be difficult. There would be legal battles and social complications and the painful work of disentangling a decade of marriage. But Sarah knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was strong enough to face it all. After all, she had built an empire while everyone was watching someone else. Rebuilding her own life would be comparatively simple. She was, after all, a woman who knew exactly what she was worth.